There is a map in the Bibliothèque nationale de France that was drawn in 1546. It covers the eastern coastline of North America from what is now Florida to the Canadian Maritimes. The cartographer was a Norman sailor named Pierre de Salier, and he spent years collecting navigational accounts from fishermen and explorers who had actually been there. The map is detailed. The coastline is recognizable. The rivers are named, and where the interior of the continent should be, there are no mountains. There are no plains. There is no desert. There is only forest. Continuous unbroken forest rendered in green ink from the Atlantic coast to the edge of the known world, with trees drawn so large they crowd each other off the page. Historians call this a decorative convention. Cartographers of the period, they say, used forest imagery to fill space they had not yet surveyed. The trees were placeholders, aesthetic choices. The maps were incomplete, and the forests were how you indicated incompleteness. That explanation has always had a problem. The men providing information to Desailliers were not decorating. They were fishermen and coastal traders who needed accurate charts to not die. They described what they saw, and what they described consistently across dozens of independent accounts collected over decades was forest. Not scattered woodland, not patches of trees between clearings. Forest so dense and continuous that multiple accounts describe sailing along the coast for weeks without seeing open land. You have been told those trees are gone because they were logged. That is true for the logging period. Yeah, it does not explain what the maps show before the logging period. It does not explain why cartographers across France, Portugal, England, and the Netherlands, working from independent sources in the same century, produced maps with the same overwhelming feature. A continent that was almost entirely trees. The scale of what those maps are recording is the thing nobody teaches you to hold in your mind. When Europeans arrived in North America, there were approximately 1 billion acres of forest east of the Mississippi alone. Not the continent. East of the Mississippi, 1 billion acres of trees that had been growing largely undisturbed for thousands of years. The oldest among them were alive before the Roman Empire. The largest among them had trunk diameters that required multiple men with linked arms to encircle. They are gone now, and not most of them. Not the old growth, almost all of them. What replaced them is so different from what was there that the word forest applied to both is a category error of the kind that makes the actual loss invisible. The maps recorded what was there before the category error began. In 1607, the first permanent English settlement at Jamestown was surrounded by forests so dense that the colonists could not see more than a few yards in any direction from the perimeter. John Smith's journals describe the trees as continuous from the coast inland, for as far as any expedition had traveled. He was not being poetic. He was a military man writing operational assessments. The trees were an obstacle, a tactical problem, something that had to be cleared before the land could function as the English understood land to function. And what Smith was describing without understanding it was one of the most complex biological systems that had ever existed on the surface of this planet. A forest that had been accumulating complexity for so long that the soil beneath it bore no resemblance to the soil that exists there now. The mycorrhizal networks connecting the root systems of individual trees across hundreds of miles. The canopy so high and dense that the light behavior at ground level was closer to the interior of a cathedral than to open sky. The fog patterns generated by transpiration from billions of trees creating their own weather systems across entire mountain ranges. None of that is in the maps. The maps show green, but the green they show is the surface indicator of something underneath that we have no living reference point for understanding. Now, look at what the maps stop showing. The transition happens across roughly 200 years of European cartography. The maps of the 1500s show forest. The maps of the 1700s show something else. Not cleared land. Something more subtle. The forests on the later maps are smaller, more bounded, separated by spaces the cartographers label as meadow or plain or improved land. The language of agricultural classification begins to replace the language of natural description. By 1750, the maps of the eastern seaboard show a landscape that is recognizably the one that exists today. Settlements connected by roads, farmland, managed woodland. The transformation from the 1546 map to the 1750 map took 200 years and covered 1 billion acres, and it happened so continuously and incrementally that no single generation experienced it as a loss. Each generation inherited a landscape slightly less forested than the one their parents knew and called it normal. There is a term for this in psychology: shifting baseline syndrome. Each generation accepts the world it inherits as the baseline against which change is measured. The old-growth forests of the eastern seaboard are not in anyone's baseline anymore. They have not been in anyone's baseline for 200 years. The maps are the only record we have of what the baseline actually was. And the maps show something that almost no living person has tried to hold in their full attention: a continent that was forest. Not a continent with forests in it. A continent that was forest the way the ocean is water. Continuously, overwhelmingly, to a depth and complexity we have no surviving analog for. The cartographers of the 1500s were not the only ones recording this. Indigenous oral traditions across the entirety of North America describe a world before contact in which the forest was the primary navigational reference for the entire continent. Not individual trees, the forest as an entity, something with behavior, something that had been there long enough to have a character that could be described and predicted and related to. The Haudenosaunee traditions of the northeastern woodlands describe a forest canopy so continuous that a squirrel could theoretically travel from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River without touching the ground. This is almost certainly a compression of something real into a useful image. But the useful image requires a forest of a density and continuity that nothing currently living in those regions resembles. The Cherokee descriptions of the southern Appalachians before contact describe a forest floor so deep in leaf matter and fallen wood that travel without established paths was nearly impossible. Not difficult, nearly impossible. The accumulated organic material of thousands of years of growth and decay had produced a substrate that was meters deep in places and functioned more like a living sponge than like soil. That substrate is gone. The thin mineral soil that exists in its place is what you get when you remove the system that built the original and replace it with something that cannot maintain it. These accounts are not in the geology papers. They are not in the cartographic literature. They are in the oral traditions of peoples whose observations about the pre-contact landscape were systematically dismissed as myth by the people who arrived and began converting the forest into material. The maps and the oral traditions agree with each other. A continent covered by something we would not recognize as forest if we stood inside it today. The question the maps force is not what happened to the trees. We know what happened to the trees. The question is what we lost access to when they went. The eastern old-growth forests were not just large. They were old enough and continuous enough to have developed biological infrastructure that does not exist anywhere in the currently living world at comparable scale. The mycorrhizal networks. The chemical signaling systems between trees that researchers only began documenting in the 1990s. The relationship between the forest canopy and the weather patterns of the entire eastern half of the continent. The river systems that ran clear because the root networks held the soil and the canopy regulated the temperature of the water. All of that is gone, not degraded, not diminished, gone in the specific sense that nothing currently living in those regions performs those functions at anything approaching the scale at which they were performed before contact. What replaced it is not nothing. Second-growth forests exist. They are real forests by any reasonable definition. But a second-growth forest in the northeastern United States is 60 to 100 years old in its oldest sections. And the old growth it replaced was 300 to 1,000 years old in its average sections, and considerably older in the sections that survived long enough to be recorded by the earliest surveyors. The difference between a 100-year-old forest and a 1,000-year-old forest is not a difference of degree. It is a difference of kind. The biological machinery that a 1,000-year-old continuous forest develops is not present in a 100-year-old stand and cannot be replicated by simply waiting 100 more years. The maps recorded the 1,000-year-old forest. Everything that came after recorded something else and called it by the same name. There is a specific document that almost nobody who writes about this period has cited. In 1724, a French Jesuit missionary named Joseph-François Lafitau published a two-volume ethnographic study of the indigenous peoples of northeastern North America. He had spent years among the Haudenosaunee, and his observations about the forest are embedded in descriptions of daily life, rather than in any formal natural history section. He writes about the sound the forest made, not the sound of individual animals or wind, the aggregate sound of the forest as a system. A low continuous presence that he describes as something you cease to notice the way you cease to notice your own breathing, and became aware of only when it briefly stopped. He was describing the acoustic environment produced by a canopy of sufficient age and density to generate its own soundscape, something distinct enough to be perceived as a unified presence, rather than a collection of individual sounds. That acoustic environment no longer exists anywhere in the formerly forested regions of North America. The canopy that produced it is gone. What Lafitau heard and had no scientific vocabulary to describe was a biological system operating at a scale and integration that we have no living reference for. The maps show the extent of that system. They cannot show what it was doing. They cannot show the water it was holding, or the weather it was generating, or the soil it was building, or the sound it was making. They show green. And the green they show covers a continent from coast to interior in a way that makes the current landscape look like something important was removed, and nobody who inherited the result was told what it was. Here's what this means for how you look at the landscape you currently live in. Every mountain range in the eastern United States was forested to its summit before contact. Not partially forested. To the summit. The bare rocky peaks that hikers photograph and call wilderness are bare because the trees were removed. The tree line on the Appalachians is not a natural phenomenon. It is a historical one. The high-elevation forests of the southern Appalachians were among the last to be cleared, and some were not fully logged until the early 20th century. The photographs exist. Men standing on what are now bare, rocky summits, surrounded by the last of the trees that had grown there for thousands of years. The maps made before those trees were removed show mountains that are invisible. Not because the cartographers failed to notice mountains, because the mountains were inside the forest. The forest was the feature. The mountains were structure inside the feature. When Desailly drew his 1546 map, he drew what the men who sailed that coast reported. They reported forest. The mountains were there. They were simply not what you saw. What you saw was forest, continuous from the coast to the interior, taller than anything that currently grows in those regions. Old enough to have developed systems and relationships and infrastructure that we are only beginning to have scientific vocabulary to describe. Gone fast enough that no generation experienced the full extent of the loss. Replaced by something that looks similar from a satellite and functions entirely differently on the ground. The maps drew it accurately. Why? We stopped being able to read what they were recording because we have no living reference for what the green they show actually meant. We look at those maps and we see a decorative convention. We see cartographers filling empty space with trees because they did not know what else to put there. What we are actually looking at is the world before we converted it, recorded by men who had no reason to lie about what they saw, and every practical reason to be accurate. The forest was the landmark. The forest was the navigation reference. The forest was the thing you described when you described where you were. It is gone now. The maps remain. And the maps show a world that nobody alive has ever seen, and that we have no way to return to, and that we have largely stopped asking questions about because the baseline that would make the loss visible has been gone for longer than anyone living can remember. The stone still carries the structure of what it replaced. The maps still carry the image of what we replaced. Both are waiting for someone to look at them and ask what it means that the world they show no longer exists, and that we cannot remember what it felt like to live inside it. The forests are not hiding. They are simply gone. The maps are not decorative. They are the record. And the record shows something we have been looking at for 500 years without understanding what we were seeing.